So today I'm delighted to be joined by author, journalist, and academic Allan Kozinn. Allan, welcome.
Great to be here, Colin.
Thanks for joining us on In My Life. Tell me, what were your earliest memories of the Beatles?
My very earliest memory is being in a place called Sears with my father. I don't know if they have Sears in Britain, but it's sort of big department store, glorified hardware store in those days. And hearing "I Want to Hold Your Hands" come through the sound system. They were, I guess, playing a radio in there. And I'd heard about the Beatles by then. This is December 63 or so. It was before they came over to play on Sullivan. Um, and I'd heard about them, and I'd heard probably the title, "I Want to Hold Your Hand," so that when I heard this record, that's "I Want to Hold Your Hand." That's the Beatles. And it was kind of exciting. Um, and so I put that down as my first one. Um, Although I could equally have put down "She Loves You," because there's another sort of moment in my life when the Beatles when I began to sort of see that, like, this is really something, was I was taking piano lessons, and my teacher's father had been one of the last students of Franz Liszt, and she had framed cigar butts of lists all through her house,
Wow.
and letters and all kinds of Liszt memorabilia. So I was learning, standard classical stuff. When I went down the stairs in front of her house, and I'm waiting on the street for my father to pick me up, and I must have been like 10 years old. And a car comes by, and it's a convertible, and the top's down because it's spring. Um, must be spring 64. And there are these high school students, which to me are really old people. When you're 10, high school is like up to 18. And there's boys and girls, and they're all singing at the top of their lungs with the radio blasting "She Loves You." And I'm thinking, wow, cars, convertible, music, girls, this is the life. That's the Beatles. I want that. you know. So that and "I Want to Hold Your Hand" are two things together from about the same few months. But I put down "I Want to Hold Your Hand" since it's the first one that I heard. And also, later in my life, I'd say around 2013, when I was working at the New York Times, they asked me to do an ebook about "I Want to Hold Your Hand." And I said, really, a book about the one song? And so that became an ebook called "Got That Something: How the Beatles' "I Want to Hold Your Hand" Changed Everything." And I think one of the reasons it was called that, "Got That Something," is because in the course of the book, a few months earlier, I had interviewed Billy Gibbons from ZZ Top,
Mhm.
because he was reconstituting his pre-ZZ Top band, which was called Moving Sidewalks. And they had put out a single of "I Want to Hold Your Hand" in 1968. And if you think about it, 1968, "I Want to Hold Your Hand" is not the song to put out. It's very 1963, 64. And they were a blues band, but they did it in a kind of bluesy way. I mean, um, the line "Got That Something" suddenly becomes very um, suggestive. You got that something. I think you understand. So I called Billy Gibbons and talked to him again about it, and said, there's something in the way you put that. And he said, yes, that's right, because we were a blues band, and that's a totally blues way of looking at it. We don't just come out and say, what you got. We just say, "You got that something." And that then became the title of the book. So, these 2 points in my life when I'm like 9 or 10, and "I Want to Hold Your Hand" comes on, and it's the first I'm hearing of them, and then carrying through all the way to 2013, getting a book out of it. So that's the first one.
So you heard the song first in December. What impact did it make when you saw the Sullivan Show? What difference did it make physically seeing the Beatles as opposed to just hearing them?
Yeah, so by then I think we'd all seen pictures of them, so we kind of knew what they were going to look like, and it wasn't a big shock. It was a shock for my parents. you know this is what they considered long hair. In fact, years and years later, when my parents retired, my mother was in Florida. She went to a garage sale and found some old Beatles records, and she said she's describing them to me because she bought them, like she thought I might need them. And we're talking about a copy of Meet the Beatles, which was the American equivalent of sort of With the Beatles, same cover. And she said, yeah, so I've got the one where they're in turtlenecks and they've got the really short hair. And I said, really short hair is not what you said at the time. I believe the word was, they look like girls. So, everyone, in those days, people had, one TV. And so you'd watch it with your parents and your family. And so we had, my parents were just sort of bemused by all this, why did they look like that? But for me, it was like, wow, these guys are really sort of rocking out, because they did that. And I saw her standing there, all my loving, and, and it was exciting. And, and everybody in my school was into it. And, I don't know if they did it in Britain, but here they put out bubblegum cards. You'd go buy for a nickel, you get a stick of gum and 5 Beatles cards. So, and everybody had those, and we all would, in the weeks after Sullivan, go down to, my friend's basement where he had the single and a record player and a broom and Beatles wigs, and we'd all, make believe we were the Beatles playing these brooms, because I was at that point still a keyboardist. I wasn't a guitarist yet. So yeah, it was just it was an incredible time. And sorry. And the thing about I Want to Hold Your Hand is it's so energetic and bright, and the harmonies and the hand claps and that little do 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 guitar riff in between lines, just everything about it just was so compelling, and it was unlike everything else in the top 40 at the time. And I was at that point only peripherally listening to the top 40 anyway, because I was studying classical stuff. But this was a whole new world, and it just was very enlivening.
And of course, it was written famously at the Ashes Music Room in Wimpole Street on piano,
right.
with John
That's
and
right.
Paul present. So quite appropriate that it should influence in some way your classical music history.
Right. Yeah, and I eventually ended up talking to Peter Asher about that, because he was there. He was one of the first people to hear it, and
Gordon too.
Gordon too. He didn't mention that Gordon was there, but yeah, and also Margaret Asher was an oboe player, was a classical person, taught George Martin.
Yeah.
So yeah, a lot of little threads come together.
And how much of the appeal was the fact that the Beatles were un-American?
As a 9-year-old, you didn't really think much about that. Except, as you're beginning to learn more and more about them as a group, you begin to sort of take in the whole, okay, well, so what does it mean that they're British? What does it mean that, they have these cool accents? What is their life like? And then you begin to sort of learn. I mean, I would say that because I was so young when they came over and I started getting interested in them, probably a lot of what I learned about Britain initially was through the lens of the Beatles. Even hearing about, in their backstory about Liverpool being bombed, and then the first time I went to London was in like 1972, I think. And I think there were still, because of the 99-year leases, there were still lots that were bombed out, that were just
Yeah.
flat, no building. I don't know if you see that anymore now. I think by now everything's built up. But when I first went there, that was part of it. And naturally, I related that to, well, so it must be like that in Liverpool where the Beatles were. So, yeah.
There are still parts of Liverpool that are relatively undeveloped. I don't think you see that in London at all. If a site's vacant, it gets developed straight away. But there's still
Yeah.
a few holes left in Liverpool that haven't been developed, sadly. So it's economically it's not recovered as quickly. But they've done a fantastic job, certainly in the main city centre.
Sure. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Liverpool is, when I first went there, it looked to me so suburban, upper middle class that I thought, well, why do we hear that Liverpool was so rough? Because it doesn't look that rough to me. But I don't think I got there until the 90s. So,
Right.
and then it was quite, built up. They have a huge Beatle industry there.
Yeah, they do. And your second choice is the first Beatles track to be not to be a love song. So one of John's compositions, Nowhere Man. What made you choose that one, Alan?
Okay. It came out here as a single in early 66 because it wasn't on the American Rubber Soul album. It was one of those things that was saved for one of those Capitol compilations of extra tracks, which was called Yesterday and Today. And that was actually the first Beatles album that I bought. I didn't get the early ones. I was still sort of stuck listening to the radio, got some of the singles. And Nowhere Man, I think what appealed to me was the opening harmonies. That was they were known for their harmonies by then, but this was sort of like a step further, a cappella harmonies to open a track. Just beautiful. I'm really sorry.
Okay.
And then the fact that, as you started reading about it, you began to read about, this is John and his own self-doubts and that kind of thing. And that was also something that, there was probably plenty of that in pop music at the time and before that, but I was still, maybe 11 now. So, I didn't know that much about the world. So the idea of, someone writing a song about his own self-doubts, and not only that, someone who is as successful and rich and famous as John Lennon of the Beatles having self-doubts. I mean, what's that about? It was a whole new thing for me. And it just, it was just sort of in that way, a different kind of song, both musically and lyrically, and, the background of it. And it was a lot of that summer of 66. You'd hear Nowhere Man all the time, and earlier throughout the year too. So it just became sort of an important part of that year for me. And then I got Yesterday and Today, which had Nowhere Man on it. And Nowhere Man meant more to me than Yesterday. Yesterday was, you would think, the big masterpiece on that album, but for me it was Nowhere Man.
And when did you become aware there were two very different Rubber Souls?
That would have been, I would have been closer to like maybe 15 or 16. I grew up in a place called Yonkers, New York. And Yonkers is just the city north of New York City. And so at a certain point, you can't just go down there by yourself all the time, if you have protective parents. So it wasn't until like 14, 15, 16, my parents began to let me go down to New York by myself. And once I did that, I ran into import shops, which they didn't have in Yonkers. and saw all these Beatles albums, like, wow, what is this? Rubber Soul with Nowhere Man on it with the Beatles, but it looks like Meet the Beatles, you know, and that was, you know, a whole world of, you know, there's another Beatle world out there, and I have to catch up with this. Also, around that same time when I was 14, Hunter Davies' biography came out, and it had the British and American discographies in the back. So I was able to look at that and say, yeah, here are all these totally different albums. I'm perfectly happy with the albums I grew up with, and yet these are the albums that the Beatles made. So I should get into that, but I didn't really, I wasn't really able to afford to get them until I was in college. So now we're talking about, you know, 18 years old, and then got all the British ones. And then, you know, listening to them, and I'm listening for specifically to an EP that had Dr. Robert on it. Now, Dr. Robert was on Yesterday and Today, my very first Beatles album.
No, it wasn't.
So
It was on Revolver.
yeah, yeah, it was one of the 3 tracks we got before everybody else
I know, you were lucky
from
then.
Revolver. And I'm listening to the mono version of it on the British EP, and I'm hearing these vocal harmonies that are not on the on the Dr. Robert I know, because the American one was an early mix, and it was in fake stereo, and I'm hearing, you know, this where they go, well, 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 you're feeling fine, you know, down and up. And I thought, wow, that's incredible. That means the mono mixes are all different than the stereo mixes. I now have to go get all the British albums in mono. And then I have to get, having given away all of my original mono American ones, I had to go buy them again, because I, you know, once I got the stereo ones, I sort of replaced them, and it didn't strike me, those differences then. But then got all those back too. So I've bought the Beatles catalog many, many, many times.
We all have. We all have. My wife's not impressed with that, but there you go. Um, what are your go-to versions, having completed your collection with UK and US versions? What do you go back to now? Do you still have affection for the original Meet the Beatles US versions?
Um, I do, but I would say from 1973 or 4 until about 2006 or 2004, I listened only to the British ones. I mean, from my point of view, it's okay, these are the albums they made. This is what I want to hear. Plus, the American ones had echo lathered all over them, and the fake stereo, which wasn't just a matter of EQ. They also put a millisecond delay between the two sides. So um, when Capitol put out those 2 boxes of US mixes, that was before the big box called American mixes, which is another story. When they put out the 2 boxes and had American mono and American stereo, I was writing an article about it, so I listened to them. And it reminded me that, you know, I do sort of have some affection for these albums. It's, you know, they're not going to ever be my go-to, but there are certain reasons that, you know, look, Meet the Beatles took all of the cover versions off with the Beatles and replaced it with, you know, just Lennon McCartney compositions plus Till There Was You. For some reason, that cover remained. And the covers ended up on the Beatles' second album. So with those 2 albums, you had 2 different sides of the Beatles that kind of was an interesting way to look at it. It wasn't the way they did it, but, you know, it kind of made a certain amount of programmatic sense. But still, and I also liked the American Rubber Soul, beginning with I've Just Seen a Face. That is a great album opener, and it's totally lost in the middle of side 2 of Help. Um, and it also makes Rubber Soul more of an acoustic album than the British one was. So I kind of like that, but nevertheless, my go-tos remain just the British ones.
Well, when we eventually get the Rubber Soul Deluxe Edition, whenever that may be, I hope we get both the UK and the US track listings included. That would be a really, really nice touch. So how do you view the work of Dave Dexter Jr.? Do you think he did more good for the Beatles than bad?
Excuse me?
How do you view Dave Dexter Jr. at Capitol and the
Dave
work that he did with
Dexter. Yeah. Um, to be generous, I'd say he was well-meaning. Um, if by well-meaning you mean that he thought he understood the American market and what the American market wanted and why we wanted things other than what the Beatles put out. um, and he felt that we wanted a certain kind of sound, like overlaid with echo and reverb. So he was wrong about all that. And I wish he hadn't done it, but he did. So, I mean, that makes him a historical character in a certain way. But the thing is that Dave Dexter Jr., from what I could tell, didn't even like the Beatles,
Hmm.
you know? So
He was a jazz buff, wasn't he?
he was,
He was a jazz buff, wasn't he? As a jazz guy.
I believe he was more of a jazz buff, you
Hmm.
know, and Capitol, you know, Capitol wasn't one of the big rock labels at the time, and they rejected the Beatles so many times before finally taking I Want to Hold Your Hand. Um, I got to know Brown Meggs, who was Capitol's president, because later in his life he became president of Angel, which was the American version of the EMI classical side. And so interviewing him as a classical guy, you know, I would eventually say, so Brown, tell me about, you know, the Beatles era and all that, because, you know, and he said, yeah, you know, at the beginning of the year when we did our budgets, we would put down the Beatles, $1 million, and then the budgets would flow from that. Like that was their that was what they knew they would have to work with based on the fact that the Beatles would sell that much.
Right.
But he was more of a classical guy, and Dexter was more of a jazz guy, as you say. So, you know, I wonder who they had there who would really look after the interests of a group like the Beatles. You know, I think the Beatles lucked out in a way with their 1967 contract, where they said, okay, from now on, you put out the albums as we make them. So finally, Pepper wasn't messed with. Can you imagine what they would have done with Pepper if left to their own devices? First of all, it would have had Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane on it, and that would have meant taking 2 songs off. So what would it have been? Lucy in the Sky, because it seemed to be about drugs, or A Day in the Life? I don't know. It doesn't even bear thinking about. I'm putting it out of my mind now that I've mentioned it.
Well, that brings us very neatly to your third and final choice. As you said, the first song recorded for the Sergeant Pepper sessions, Strawberry Fields Forever.
Right. Strawberry Fields Forever probably is my favorite Beatles track. When it came out, you know, by then I was into this thing where, you know that every 3 or 4 months, the Beatles were going to put out a new single. And so I would come home from school, and there were 2 main rock stations in New York, WMCA and WABC. And I would, while pretending to do my homework, just be going back and forth on the dial between those 2 stations every 3 months or so, because I get this feeling that, like, okay, it's about time for a new Beatles single. And I might have to do it for a week before finally you hit pay dirt and some DJ would come on and say, we've got the new Beatles single, you know. And so early 67, they got the new Beatles single, and it's Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane. These are like so different than everything that had come before, you know. And I was just fascinated by it. I mean, I read stories about people who, well, there's a clip of them on Hollywood Palace, an American, teenage TV show, and they show the two films in black and white, and they ask kids in the audience what they think, and a lot of these kids just didn't know what to make of it. They didn't know what to make of their look with beard and mustache, and they didn't know what to make of the sound. And some of them are saying, yeah, I like the monkeys better. They look like someone's grandfathers. And I didn't understand that. It was like, wow, this is, first of all, musically, this is really sophisticated stuff. Only 3 years ago, they were doing I Want to Hold Your Hand. There's a huge gap between I Want to Hold Your Hand and Strawberry Fields. And, in their evolution, they took those steps. You can hear it if you listen straight through. But if you take Strawberry Fields on its own, it's just such an amazing piece of music. And then the lyrics, nothing to get hung about. And, it's just, it really makes you sort of wonder, what is this all about? And you are spending a lot of time listening to it, trying to parse it, and I just loved it, and that was before hearing, the whole story of the two different takes joined together, and they were in different keys, and what George Martin did there. And, eventually, we've all heard all the outtakes and the demos and things. And it's just such an extraordinary piece that that sort of keeps on giving in a way. And when I started writing for the Wall Street Journal as a freelancer after I retired from the Times, they were telling me, we want you to do, classical record reviews if you want, classical concert reviews. And we have this column called Masterpieces, where you write about how a piece was written and what elements are in it, what makes it a masterpiece. And so the very first thing I proposed to them was Strawberry Fields, and they said fine. So I did it, and they've let me actually cover the Beatles expanded reissues as well. So sort of like at the Times, I had classical was my thing, but I had a specialty in the Beatles. At the Times, it was partly because our pop guys were interested in stuff that happened either before 1960 or since last Tuesday, and so the Beatles were in that nether zone that they let me do.
Strawberry Fields Forever famously in this country, in the UK, broke the string of #1 Beatles tracks. A crooner called Engelbert Humperdinck got to #1, and tragically, as a result, Strawberry Fields Forever never got to appear on the best-selling CD of the Beatles' career, One.
That's right.
Which is a really huge omission, isn't it? Such a mesmerizing, joyful song that just didn't make the cut.
Yeah. And, like I say, probably my favorite Beatles track. I mean, although it's very hard to pick one out because I don't think they did a bad track in their entire output. But Strawberry Fields really is something special. And I don't know why it didn't get to #1, because what was it? Was it Release Me, Engelbert Humperdinck? Was that it? Engelbert, sorry. That is not for the ages.
And on that note, we'll end it. Allan, thank you very much for being on In My Life today and sharing your selections with us. Thanks again.
Thank you, Colin.